Several years ago, my mother gave me a diary belonging to my great-great-grandmother, and I read it and became absolutely hooked. Her daily entries had my head spinning with so many possibilities for research. I then began collecting other rural diaries, and in 2015 created the Rural Diary Archive. We now have over 200 diarists in the collection, many of whose journals are available to read, search, and transcribe online for free. We now have transcribers from Australia, England, the United States, and Canada, and scholars and the public are using the diaries for research. They're employing digital tools on the transcripts and having fun making radio shows and mini documentaries. There's something very powerful and immediate about diaries, about putting ordinary people and their daily lives at the center of history that really reaches people. Personally, I was struck by how often households helped each other, and so began my journey into the heart of neighborhood. My book, Being Neighbours, Cooperative Work in Rural Culture 1830 to 1960, is based on these diaries and will appear in the fall 2022. I thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Frances and Ruth Redelmeier Professorship in Rural History for making this research possible. Scholars have studied diverse examples of cooperative work, from the peat and seaweed harvesters in Scotland and Ireland, to maize and cotton farmers in Kenya, to families in Germany, Finland, Norway, and Sweden who cooperated to spin or to supervise brewing and animals giving birth. Internationally, this labor is associated with relatively equal, small-scale, autonomous households, with farms large enough to require assistance at peak periods of production, and with a scarcity of landless laborers for hire. My study in the southern part of the province of Ontario fits this description. In Ontario, where mixed farming predominated until the 1960s, neighbours would work together when a task was labor-intensive, time-sensitive, required combined strength or a wide range of expertise. They called this work a bee, as people worked like bees in a hive. Early settlers used cooperative work to establish farms out of the forest by clearing fields and raising buildings. And by the 1850s, they were starting to use new machinery as it became available. Bee workers would speed up production by hauling produce to the threshing machine, and then in later years, the hay press and buzz saw, and these were usually operated by custom operators. Cooperative work ranged from this exchange labor between small groups for routine seasonal tasks like threshing, to the much larger festive labor groups that were called to raise a barn. My study contributes to the international literature on cooperative work by situating it within the household economy and exploring the nature of the exchange. It also brings together the separate literatures on cooperative work and neighborhood. Cooperative work condensed and distributed energy, equipment, and skill around the neighborhood, delineating its geography. And in the process, participants created a sense of belonging, a local resource, knowledge born out of working together, and a code of behavior. It's no wonder that the bee was also referred to as neighboring. A neighborhood is a smaller unit than community. The small number of studies of neighborly relations usually focus on urban centers. I would argue, though, that it was even more important in rural areas. But it was considered to be so ordinary, this idea of neighboring, that an understanding of it has really slipped away with the oral culture of previous generations. Farm families relied on this form of labor for the basis of production and attended on average about 10 bees every year. Even when cash became more prevalent in the 20th century, farmers continued to exchange labor to reduce costs, time, and uncertainty of having to hire labor, just when others were competing for it too, especially during harvest time. They preferred to use what cash that they had to purchase store goods, equipment, livestock, and land. And surrounded by other farm households in a similar kind of position, they had easy access to help from people they knew and trusted. I argue that though bees have come to symbolize the good old days of neighborliness, people's cooperation was not natural or simple because it involved families balancing their individual needs with responsibility to neighbors. As a result, neighboring involved negotiation, flexibility, surveillance, confrontation, and reconciliation. Neighborhood emerged as a powerful force in their lives. Diary entries like these formed the basis of my analysis. Elizabeth Simpson, June 4th, 1878.
Minnie went to W.H. Hunter's. They have raised 2 barns and had a bee for hauling brick, also a bee to make a tufted quilt. There were a great number of people there, about 200 sat down to dinner. Salisbury had a team there and the other boys were at the raising.
Elizabeth Simpson, Friday the 8th of August, 1879.
Our folks proposed threshing tomorrow, so we were busy preparing. Made 19 apple and cherry pies this afternoon.
Saturday the 9th.
I do not know how I should have done if Minnie had not come to help me. She put the carpet down in the dining room, which looks nicer than ever, and hung the pictures. They threshed barley till tea time and fall wheat afterwards.
Thomas Niblock, 1850.
If you suppose that neighbors help one another in these things for nothing, you are very much mistaken.
James Carpenter, 28 February, 1881.
John Carpenter helped me forenoon. Made him an axe handle and called it square.
Members of a bee network were constantly creating their neighborhood from the inside, one that was dynamic and whose boundaries changed as people moved in and out owing to age and transience. Men were far more involved in the bee network than women, though women had their own specific female bees and organized mixed bees for youth. Diary analysis revealed who formed the core of these work groups and how membership was not haphazard or all-inclusive. Walter Hope's bee network is a really good example of this. His network was limited to people who were close enough to transport horses and machinery. So the networks usually were extended a radius of anywhere from 2 to 6 kilometers. And his farm and his neighbors are in the orange here. Physical distance also featured and limited the network. You can see here that there were rivers on either side of his road, which created barriers for membership extending much beyond the road itself. There were barriers for human geography too. Hope preferred to work with his Protestant neighbors here in orange and did not extend his network northward to include the Irish Catholics, featured here as the black dots. So most members had relatively equal-sized farms so that it was easy to balance the exchange. Finally, the core of the bee network was defined by people with similar work ethics and commitment, who were known and who were reliable. And this was to guard against free riders or, freeloaders who might ask others to help, but give shoddy work in return. Members of a bee network performed their work publicly, rotating to different farmsteads, woodlots, and kitchens, discussing and scrutinizing each other. And as a result, they developed reputations, trust, and a changing participatory knowledge. They learned who was the strongest, who had the specialized knife or cauldron, who could be trusted to return borrowed items, and who might be careless or who would lose their temper in the heat of the moment. They became structurally dependent on each other, as their neighborhoods were more self-sufficient in labor skills and machinery than any individual household. They also developed an ideology of close association, the belief that more benefits accrued to one's life in a mutual relationship with neighbors than by remaining aloof. Few wanted to risk alienating their neighbors because that could be costly financially and socially. For mutuality to work, they needed to have a shared understanding, a code of reciprocity, something perhaps more practical than the Bible's message of love thy neighbor. The code was that if you wanted to benefit from cooperative labor, you needed to be willing to contribute labor cheerfully to others when called upon and respect their property and person. The main criticism of exchange work involved returning the labor. It might be inconvenient when called upon or take you away from more important tasks on your own farm. Diarists were very alert to this issue and used their diaries to record the exchanges. For example, William Beattie in 1849 wrote this in his diary, recording the labor that he gave to others. Jack goes to George Toe's dung bee. And for the labor he received from his neighbors, he wrote, Thomas Davis sent his horses and son to plow. So he was recording the type of work done, because logging, for example, was far more intense than a paring bee or a corn husking bee. He was identifying the person sent because people in the household offered different qualities of workmanship and could be spared to different degrees from the home farm. And he noted the time spent away, which usually was a half or full day. In short, he was aware of the opportunity costs. Diaries show that household heads reduced the opportunity costs by sending a surrogate. Usually that was a grown son, so that the household head could continue with farm management tasks and trading in town. Benjamin Crawford did this. His sons began going to bees for their dad around the age of 14, and they continued to do this until marriage, and they set up their own homes. So we see Augustus, George, and Charles going to bees, and then when they marry, marked here by the heart, Daniel takes their place until he marries. Families with grown sons were some of the biggest players in the bee network. George Homewood sent his son to, get this, 180 out of 200 bees over a 33-year period from 1893 to 1926. People also used substitute payments because rarely did a double coincidence of want exist on mixed farms, which made it hard to quickly square things in a simple manner, i.e., you came to my logging bee, so I'll go to yours. Instead, debts lingered, and they got settled over time in a loose way, tying people together over the years and drawing other family members into the exchange. James Cameron lived on an island, and he beed with a diverse group of people, Protestants and Catholics of Irish, Scottish, and French Canadian origin, and Indigenous men who lived on a nearby reserve. Of the 19 families he neighbored with, only the 6 here in the blue strip were repaid with bee labor. The other 13 families were repaid in ways that were more convenient for James Cameron and reflected his skills in the neighborhood and what his helpers needed. So the 3 Nicholsons who came to Cameron's husking bee were repaid later when Cameron lent his saw and gun and carted 3 loads of straw for them, so that in a loose sort of way, things evened out. Mr. Hamilton came to Cameron's sawing bee, and in return, Cameron sent his sister and niece to help dig Hamilton's potatoes. The voluntary and flexible nature of neighboring is really key to understanding why it was successful and persisted on farms as they became more market-oriented and capitalized. As a code of reciprocity governed the work, it also extended to the feast that followed. The feast was the first installment, really, in the payback system. It was the highlight of the day, the central element of the day, and it had ritual significance as people sat around arranged in a very democratic fashion, temporarily setting aside what hierarchies might exist. Whether feeding 15 threshers or 200 assembled at a barn raising, hosts were expected to do their best, and guests knew what their neighbors could afford. To provide a fitting feast, women combined thrift and hospitality, attempting to do their best within their abilities and financial means, but without overstepping neighborhood standards. It was every woman's nightmare to run out of food, for generosity and abundance demonstrated gratitude to workers and neighborliness. In fact, threshing crews were known to slow down or speed up their work in order to increase their chances of eating at a home where the food was known to be good. When a woman was a stingy hostess or deliberately tried to outdo other women in the neighborhood, it promoted rivalry and bad feelings. It struck at the heart of neighborliness and at notions of fair exchange and economy and the willingness to work together. Whether it was a lazy worker or bad food at a bee, men and women used gossiping and storytelling to regulate people's behavior. They needed to be publicly cordial to each other while they were working together, but they could express their opinions privately or in a humorous way to bring about conformity. When it came to food, exceptionally poor meals rapidly entered the gossip mill and were sometimes retold for literally decades as cautionary tales or to reinforce standards. One early 20th century story about a family from Toronto who moved onto a farm and where stingy exists. Without understanding that roast beef was expected at the feast, they served bologna, and the story ends in didactic fashion that nobody ever came back to their farm to work. Another story from the same era recalled a woman in Mono Township who was prone to putting on airs, and she had bedecked her table with her finest linens, and so the threshers wanted to teach her a lesson, and when they sat down, they wiped their dirty hands on the linen. And this story suitably ends with the uppity woman never showing off again. When things went well, a bee created a strong sense of belonging. The barn raising, the largest bee, is a really fine example of this. Even though neighbors knew that the host family was the privileged one and would have the new barn, everything that day at the barn raising, the work and the festivities downplayed individual gain and accentuated group cohesion. A bank barn building craze lasted from about the 1860s to up until World War I. And these bank barns were expensive. And by calling 100 to 200 men to raise the bents of the barn, you could reduce your labor cost substantially. The raising was indeed a creative community act. It had a lot of visible power and drama that really served to pull people together and left a lasting memory. As the moment arrived to raise the bent, the men grew quiet. Then the framer yelled out, "Yo heave!" And with sheer combined strength, the bent was put into place. It was a thrilling sight and sound. In only a few hours, almost like magic, an imposing structure rose from the ground. This was festive labor. Festive labor. The host had a much weaker obligation to reciprocate than with a threshing, and hospitality and entertainment were really the main forms of repayment. Drama characterized the day and took a variety of forms. There was a profound sense of movement, of people arriving, of throngs of men running along the beams, of crowds watching, and then the big rush to the table afterwards. With the bank barn's large reinforced floor, barn dances were very popular right after the raising. Now, these were not couple dances. They were mixer dances, dances where the dancers moved as part of a larger group and were always changing partners. Like the raising, this kind of dancing downplayed individual accomplishment and accentuated group coordination and cohesion. Likewise, hundreds of photographs of the barn raising have survived and reflect the same sort of message. Owners are rarely given a separate identity. The individual family is, in fact, subordinated to the community in these images. And it was a practical message, particularly practical as long as sharing labor was an integral aspect of the sustainability of individual households. But there is a darker side to cooperative work and neighborhood. A bee gone wrong could result in unwanted costs and conflict. Violence or careless behavior were serious breaches in the code of reciprocity and required some kind of resolution. Most studies of dispute resolution focus on the courts and church, but neighborhood itself could be a powerful force. The need to share resources and carry on with work put pressure on neighbors to find solutions and quickly restore their working relationships. Accidents were most likely to occur at barn raisings, where men could be injured or killed. And threshing bees, too, were notorious for the death and maiming they left in their wake, with victims being drawn into the blades of the cylinder. I have found 100 threshing accidents, and over half of them involved amputation or death. Accidents threw neighborhoods into instant disarray. Workers were the first response team. They had to attend to the dead and bereaved. If negligence was suspected, then an inquest was called and neighbors had to testify before outsiders. And you can imagine that this was a situation fraught with ramifications for future relations. Not surprisingly, participants at the bee were tight-lipped and reluctant to assign blame. When Charles Stanford was killed by a falling bent in 1876, evidence at the inquest revealed that the men had not kept aligned under the bent and it had shifted out of control. The jury cast suspicion on the man giving the orders, but witnesses refused to blame him. By denying or diffusing blame, people could resume their working groups with less cost and breakdown of relations than proceeding through the courts. They focused instead on the victims. In some cases, they would support a widow and her children for years, holding bees to cut her firewood and harvest her crops. In this manner, the neighborhood employed an informal type of restorative justice, which was really essentially about restoring reciprocity. The same cannot be said about violence, which clearly breached the code of neighborly behavior. In these tightly knit neighborhoods, people needed to vent frustrations from time to time, and the Bee provided a public venue where issues could come to the head in front of a valued audience. I've discovered many fights, and I've discovered 17 cases of murder. At a Bee, the opportunity to drink, boast, flirt, and compete instilled high spirits and created a very volatile atmosphere. Of course, avoiding a fight was the preferred route, but if a man was physically threatened, it was honorable for him to defend his reputation while he had an audience. Violence had a rather ritualized pattern, which suggests that to a certain degree, it was tolerated and viewed as a socially useful way to vent pent-up feelings and get on with work. It wasn't unusual to find two adversaries who would fight for hours, while the other workers went about their work, taking it for granted that the men would eventually tire out or settle. If violence resulted in serious bodily harm, then workers assembled did as much as they could to contain the collateral damage. They cared for the victims, they called the constable and the coroner. Above all, they wanted to avoid the destructive cycle of vengeance, whereby fear and suspicion could make working together nearly impossible in the future. Simple, swift reparations were desirable, and sometimes a money payment was the answer. During a fight started by raftsmen at the Ferguson's wool-pulling bee, Mrs. Ferguson fled into the bush and then died of exposure. Rather than going to court, Mr. Ferguson accepted money from the raftsmen. This was a way to avoid expenses and time away from his farm had he engaged in the court process, and it put an end to the affair. Sometimes dysfunctional neighborhoods existed where the distrust between people was so deeply ingrained that they were unable to make things right without resorting to retributive justice. The Donnelly family of Lucan were really the worst kind of neighbors you could have. They used fear, threats, and violence to influence people. The first really serious incident occurred in 1857 when James Donnelly murdered his enemy, Patrick Farrell, at a logging bee. The ensuing court case split the community into factions and fostered a cycle of vengeance for over 20 years, as enemies burnt barns and slit horses' necks. Every year, neighbors needed these strong-bodied Donnelly boys to help thresh, and they feared the consequences of excluding them. Then in 1879, the Donnellys sabotaged threshing equipment at 3 farms, and that seemed to be the last straw, and they were expelled from their neighboring network. None of their neighbors would work with them anymore. A vigilante committee was formed, and in the early hours of the 4th of January, 1880, 20 men with blackened faces entered the Donnelly home and killed them. The community believed justice had been served, and no one came forward at the trial to say otherwise. Such was the power of neighborhood. Now, this was an extreme case. Most of the time, neighbors worked together very effectively in their bee networks. In trying to balance their own needs with obligations to neighbors, they created networks that were informal, flexible, diffuse, voluntary, and they abided by the norms and constraints that they had created themselves. These are the reasons cooperative labor remained popular until the 1960s and is fondly remembered. Neighborhood was a powerful force in their lives. Thank you.